Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 8 of the Garrote podcast. I am your host, Chingachgook, and I am once again in studio with my co-host, Mr. Howard Roark. Today's episode, when compared to previous episodes, is going to be slightly unique. For those of you who are new to the podcast, welcome. For those of you who are returning, welcome back. Our default format for each episode is simple. We set out to define a variety of terms that Howard and I use as shorthand in our common parlance, thereby offering you, the audience at home, the benefit of directly using these conceptual tools. That's the reason why, if you are new to the show, we strongly recommend you go back and listen to the episodes in sequence, because we are purposefully attempting to build out a toolkit that builds upon material that has already been established in previous episodes. Today is special because the term we will be discussing in this episode is conspicuous for a number of reasons. First, it is solitary. Unlike other terms in the toolkit, today's term does not cleanly match up with any other specific term. Because, and this is in fact my second point, today's term is more of a metaphor than it is an actual delineated term in the vein of, let's say, the same way the logos is a term or barbing is a term. Ergo, today's episode will by necessity involve a large amount of drifting, because simply describing the term on its own would probably take less than 10 minutes. That makes for great cliff notes, but is a terrible podcast episode premise. However, more importantly, the weight and power of this term, this metaphor, stems from the stories that gave rise to its use. At this juncture, I'll take a brief moment to take a subtle jab at my co-host in that this is a mode of discourse that is extremely imprecise, because it is a mode of discourse that meanders and wanders through story and narrative, and from that story and narrative arises the thickness, the substance of the meaning behind the term that this metaphor is trying to encapsulate. Distilling it down to its succinct term, unlike other terms we have dealt with in this podcast, is not where the primary value lies. The primary value of today's episode will derive from exploring those meandering roads that give rise to what I see to be one of the most powerful memes that exist in what I am describing to be the toolkit. The term, the title, the name of this metaphor is the Shaman. Now, it seems odd on its face. It's very easy to go to something like dictionary.com and type in the word shaman and get back a description of some kind of tribal religious figure. But it is an icon. It is an image that represents a mode of being, a mode of human understanding that is extremely important to acknowledge. It is pre-scientific, certainly, but it is still, nevertheless, entirely necessary to understand, and entirely necessary for the individual to be able to dip into when such need arises. For the sake of the record, I was the one who introduced this term into parlance in the context of the conversations that Howard and I had over the years. This term came to me from a couple of things. First of all, due to my own intellectual journey and tradition, it is a concept that I possessed and understood from the days of my youth, but I had no way to describe it. My ability to describe this concept came after I read a novel entitled Till We Have Faces by C.S. Lewis. Given this introduction, I think that the most productive starting point for today's episode is to take you, the audience, on a tour of the source material that gave rise to this term, the shaman. And from there, allow that growth to proceed and open as a flower grows and opens throughout the course of today's dialogue. C.S. Lewis is a very, very well-known author and writer, the generator of a wide variety of literature, both fiction and nonfiction. He is probably most well-known for The Chronicles of Narnia, which is a well and good contribution to the realm of children's literature. But unfortunately, we seem to live in a world where the generic individual is not familiar with his work beyond the Narnia series. And it is actually his work outside of the Narnia series that contains a lot of the meat and the power of his most noteworthy ideas. For those of you who have not read Till We Have Faces, the premise of the novel is that it takes place in some village, semi-tribal society in the Europe of antiquity, pre-literate society that is aware of and has very brief contacts with ancient Greek civilization. So it's the time of the ancient Greeks, but it takes place in what would have been considered the barbarian lands of the time. People who would not have the ability to record their own histories and their own civilizations. Those people who are functionally lost to time because it was the Greeks at that time that were actually creating history, creating the materials by which we in modern times could look back and figure out what was going on back then. And there's a main character who narrates the novel. She is a princess, one of 3 princesses in this semi-tribal society. And in this particular scene that I will be sharing with the audience, the king is facing troubles, particularly with regards to the stability of his kingdom. And it seems to be that his troubles are starting to take on a supernatural character insofar as the explanations start revolving around problems with the gods, offending the gods. So things are not well with the gods, so therefore trouble is afoot. It's a very, very archetypal story in this regard. So in this scene, the priest, the religious leader, they call him the priest, but he is more of a tribal religious leader, comes to the king and starts explaining sort of what's going on. Now, in the king's service is a longtime Greek captive POW, who is called the Fox in this story. So you have the king, you have the narrator, you have the Fox, and you have the religious leader who's called the priest. And the Fox and the priest in this scene have an exchange that, when I read it, unlocked my ability to be able to describe a mode of thinking, a mode of thought, a mode of information processing that I had hitherto been completely unable to articulate in any regard, in any manner. But after reading this novel, I was able to proceed because I finally had an analogy to make. And from the analogy, we can perhaps then start hammering out a definition, but this is such a special term, not only for my own use, but in terms of my interactions with Howard, that, as I said earlier, I find it to be of the utmost importance to take you, the audience, on the tour, the full spectrum of wanderings that gave rise to the term the shaman being introduced in our parlance. For those who have access to a copy, or who wish to follow along, I will now be reading from the beginning of chapter 5 of Till We Have Faces by C.S. Lewis. My father greeted the priest and wished him joy of his recovery, and called for wine to be given to him. But the priest held up his hand and said, No, king, I am under a strong vow, and neither food nor drink must pass my lips till I have given my message. He spoke well enough now, though weakly, and I noticed how much thinner he was since his sickness. As you please, servant of Ungit, said the king. What's this of a message? I am speaking to you, king, with the voice of Ungit, and the voice of all the people and elders and nobles of Glome. Did all these then send you with a message? Yes, we were all gathered, or those who could speak, for all were gathered, last night, and even till this day's daybreak, in the house of Ungit. Were you Death and Scabs? Said my father, frowning. It's a new fashion to hold an assembly without the king's bidding, and newer still to hold it without bidding the king to it. There would have been no reason in bidding you to it, king, seeing that we came together not to hear what you would say to us, but to determine what we would say to you. My father's look grew very black. And being gathered together, said the priest, we reckoned up all the woes that have come upon us. First, the famine, which still increases. Second, the pestilence. Third, the drought. Fourth, the certain expectation of war by the next spring at the latest. Fifth, the lions. And lastly, king, your own barrenness of sons, which is hateful to Ungit. That's enough, shouted the king. You old fool, do you think I need you or any of the other wiseacres to tell me where my own belly aches? Hateful to Ungit, is it? Why does Ungit not mend it then? She's had bulls and rams and goats from me in plenty, blood enough to sail a ship on if all were reckoned. The priest jerked his head as if, though blind, he were looking at the king. And now I saw better how his thinness had changed him. He looked like a vulture. I was more afraid of him than I had been. The king dropped his eyes. Bulls and rams and goats will not win Ungit's favor while the land is impure, said the priest. I have served Ungit these 63 years, and I have learned one thing for certain. Her anger never comes upon us without cause, and it never ceases without expiation. I have made offerings to her for your father and your father's father, and it has always been the same. We were overthrown long before your day by the king of Esser, and that was because there was a man in your grandfather's army who had lain with his sister and killed the child. He was the accursed. We found him out and expiated his sin, and then the men of Glome chased the men of Esser like sheep. Your father himself could have told you how one woman, little more than a child, cursed Ungit's son, the god of the mountain, in secret. For her sake, the floods came. She was the accursed. We found her out and expiated her sin, and Shennet returned into her banks. And now, by all the signs I have reckoned over you, we know that Ungit's anger is far greater than ever within my memory. Thus we all said in her house last night. We all said, we must find the accursed. Though every man knew that he himself might be the accursed, no man spoke against it. I had not a word to say against it, though I knew that the accursed might be I, or you, king. For we all knew, and you may hold it for certain, that there will be no mending of all our ills till the land is purged. Ungit will be avenged. It's not a bull or a ram that will quiet her now. You mean she wants a man? Said the king. Yes, said the priest, or woman. If they think I can get them a captive in war at present, they must be mad. The next time I take a thief, you can cut his throat over Ungit if you like. That is not enough, king, and you know it. We must find the accursed, and she, or he, must die by the rite of the great offering. What is a thief more than a bull or a ram? This is not to be a common sacrifice. We must make the great offering. The brute has been seen again, and when it comes, the great offering must be made. That is how the accursed must be offered. The brute? It's the first I've heard of it. It may be so. Kings seem to hear very little. They do not know even what goes on in their own palaces. But I hear. I lie awake in the nights, very long awake, and Ungit tells me things. I hear of terrible doings in this land, mortals aping the gods and stealing the worship due to the gods. I looked at the fox and said soundlessly, by the shaping of my lips, Redaval. The king was walking up and down the room with his hands clasped behind his back and his fingers working. You're doting, he said. The brute's a tale of my grandmother's. It may well be, said the priest, for it was in her time that the brute was last seen, and we made the great offering, and it went away. Who has ever seen this brute? Asked my father. What is it like, eh? Those who have seen it closest can least say what it is like, king, and many have seen it of late. Your own chief shepherd on the grey mountains saw it the night the first lion came. He fell upon the lion with a burning torch, and in the light of the torch he saw the brute, behind the lion, very black and big, a terrible shape. As the priest said this, the king's walk had brought him close to the table where I and the fox sat with our tablets and other tools for writing. The fox slid along the bench and whispered something in my father's ear. Well said, fox, muttered my father. Speak up. Say it to the priest. By the king's permission, said the fox. The shepherd's tale is very questionable. If the man had a torch of necessity, the lion would have made a big black shadow behind it. The man was scared and new waked from sleep. He took a shadow for a monster. That is the wisdom of the Greeks, said the priest. But Glome does not take counsel with slaves, not even if they are a king's favorites. And if the brute was a shadow, king, what then? Many say it is a shadow. But if that shadow begins coming down into the city, look to yourself. You are of divine blood, and doubtless fear nothing. But the people will fear. Their fear will be so great that not even I will be able to hold them. They will burn your palace about your ears. They will bar you in before they burn it. You would be wiser to make the great offering. How is it made? Said the king. It has never happened in my time. It is not done in the house of Ungit, said the priest. The victim must be given to the brute, for the brute is, in a mystery, Ungit herself, or Ungit's son, the god of the mountain, or both. The victim is led up the mountain to the holy tree, and bound to the tree and left. Then the brute comes. That is why you angered Ungit just now, king, when you spoke of offering a thief. In the great offering, the victim must be perfect, for, in holy language, a man so offered is said to be Ungit's husband, and a woman is said to be the bride of Ungit's son, and both are called the brute's supper. And when the brute is Ungit, it lies with the man, and when it is her son, it lies with the woman, and either way there is devouring. Many different things are said, many sacred stories, many great mysteries. Some say the loving and the devouring are all the same thing. For in sacred language, we say that a woman who lies with a man devours the man. That is why you are so wide of the mark, king, when you think a thief, or an old worn-out slave, or a coward taken in battle would do for the great offering. The best in the land is not too good for this office. The king's forehead, I saw, was clammy now. The holiness and horror of divine things were continually thickening in that room. All at once, the fox burst out. Master, master, let me speak. Speak on, said the king. Do you not see, master, said the fox, that the priest is talking nonsense? A shadow is to be an animal, which is also a goddess, which is also a god, and loving is to be eating. A child of 6 would talk more sense. And a moment ago, the victim of this abominable sacrifice was to be the accursed, the wickedest person in the whole land, offered as a punishment. And now it is to be the best person in the whole land, the perfect victim, married to the god as a reward. Ask him which it means. It can't be both. If any hope had put up its head within me when the fox began, it was killed. This sort of talk could do no good. I knew what had happened to the fox, and he had forgotten all his wiles, even in a way his love and fears for Psyche, simply because things such as the priest had been saying put him beyond all patience. I have noticed that all men, not only Greek men, if they have clear wits and ready tongues, will do the same. "We are hearing much Greek wisdom this morning, King," said the priest, "and I have heard most of it before. I did not need a slave to teach it to me. It is very subtle, but it brings no rain and grows no corn. Sacrifice does both. It does not even give them boldness to die. That Greek there is your slave because in some battle he threw down his arms and let them bind his hands and lead him away and sell him, rather than take a spear thrust in his heart. Much less does it give them understanding of holy things. They demand to see such things clearly, as if the gods were no more than letters written in a book. I, King, have dealt with the gods for 3 generations of men, and I know that they dazzle our eyes and flow in and out of one another like eddies on a river, and nothing that is said clearly can be said truly about them. Holy places are dark places. It is life and strength, not knowledge and words, that we get in them. Holy wisdom is not clear and thin like water, but thick and dark like blood. Why should the accursed not be both the best and the worst?" The priest looked more and more like a gaunt bird as he was speaking, not unlike the bird mask that lay on his knees, and his voice, though not loud, was no longer shaking like an old man's. The fox sat hunched together with his eyes fixed on the table. The taunt about being taken in war, I guessed, had been a hot iron to some old ulcer in his soul. Certainly, I would in that moment have hanged the priest and made the fox a king if power had been given to me, but it was easy to see on which side the strength lay. In my notes, I have jotted down next to the term, the shaman, a addendum that states, "A metaphor that describes the relationship between articulated and unarticulated knowledge or understanding." We'll get into that momentarily. In conjunction with the term the shaman, another phrase that has directly come out of this passage between the two of us, Howard, is the term much Greek wisdom we have heard this day. There are about 3 different directions that I could go from here, but this is where the drifting begins. Is there anything you'd like to say before I untether the balloon and let it start floating around, metaphorically speaking?
The things that I have to say, it seems they are going to come out in the material that is about to come up. So I don't have anything immediately to say on the subject. The definition of the term is somewhat limiting. I have a couple of questions that I could ask, but again, I think that those are going to come out inevitably in the following discussion.
So, here we go. The audience at home, at this point, should know fairly clearly that the work of Dr. Jordan Peterson is a work that both you and I greatly respect. Returning to this idea of story and taking a tour of this conceptual landscape. After I read this novel, I was going through Dr. Peterson's lectures that he's made widely available on YouTube. Specifically, his classroom lectures during his time at the University of Toronto. There was one lecture in particular that really stuck with me, and he was talking about the ways in which human knowledge and human understanding can be categorized. Because he's always talking about order and chaos. And another angle at his description of order and chaos comes from the known versus the unknown, what humans know versus what humans don't know. And you can draw a circle to represent the sum of all human knowledge. And that as time goes on, that circle gradually expands. That's a fairly basic and easy to understand visual representation on how human understanding expands. Because the human understanding is expanding into something. The idea being that knowledge comes from a place that is objective. And if you were to bring the thumb down on that in the most painfully obvious manner, that would be the way something as basic as science works. How does scientific discovery work? Well, there's something that exists out in the world, it operates, it functions. You, the individual, or mankind in general, doesn't understand how this thing operates. So as scientists go investigate it, study it, learn it, the scientific method is a method that presupposes from the outset that knowledge about the outside world is attainable. It's not that you're creating it, it's there, it's just now this thing that had its independent existence is now brought into the realm of human understanding. So the circle grows. That's fairly simple. In this particular lecture, Dr. Peterson divided these two things as the known versus the unknown versus knowledge. What was particularly fascinating about this lecture that he posted was that his diagram on his PowerPoint slide wasn't simply a circle entitled knowledge and outside the circle entitled the unknown. It was two concentric circles. It was one circle inside of another circle. And the way that these circles divided, the innermost circle was called articulated knowledge, and the outer circle was called unarticulated knowledge. And one of the things that is a recurrent theme in his lecture series, particularly when he talks about ancient Mesopotamian religion, he has an entire commentary on Marduk. He has an entire commentary on mythological stories of the Egyptian gods. He has a very similar approach with his analysis of the scriptures. The idea being that these stories form over thousands of years at the very least, certainly long before they ever got written down, to encapsulate axioms that the pre-literate civilizations of the time knew to be true. But because they do not have access to bringing things into full fidelity definition as what we are trying to do in this podcast right now, the next best thing that these pre-literate civilizations had were stories, narratives, myth. One of the things that Dr. Peterson does is he talks about this is functionally the purpose of artwork. One of the things, if I'm remembering this correctly, that he said in that particular lecture was that these truths are first encapsulated by the dramatists in story. And then later on down the line are the philosophers of later generations who will then take those stories and then harvest out in full abstracted form the axioms that were contained in these stories and narratives and myths, these archetypes that were serving as the vessels for these axioms. And he describes this a lot with painting. Particularly, he has this story where he suddenly had this urge to take out his canvas from his closet and start doing a charcoal drawing. And he describes this manic situation where he's in his room and he's doing this charcoal drawing, but he has no idea what it is that he's drawing. He's just trying to get at something. And then when he's done, he steps back and he looks at it, and it's a picture of Jesus Christ nailed to the cross with a snake wrapped around his waist, staring at the individual who is looking at the charcoal drawing. And he's looking at this and saying, what the heck does this mean? What is this getting at? He talks about artists, dramatists, engaging in their work, and their work being described as a situation in which the individual doesn't quite know what it is they're getting at. If I'm remembering the lecture correctly, he says, I know there's this thing here. I don't understand it. I don't know what it means, but it's kind of like this. And he goes through multiple examples of artwork from a variety of different periods, dating all the way back to antiquity and before. Like I said, he takes this methodology and he goes all the way back to the mythological stories of Marduk. And from that, he is able to harvest a lot of the axioms that gave rise to the bulk of a lot of his work, whether that be 12 Rules, Maps of Meaning, any of the lectures, the biblical series. So his chart on his PowerPoint of the concentric circles of the articulated knowledge, the unarticulated knowledge, and then the unknown is a very strong resonance with the exchange that we see in a scene like Till We Have Faces between the fox and the priest. Unarticulated knowledge is messy. It looks like garble, but it is entirely necessary and cannot be lightly done away with. So, in my own conversations with you, Howard, the arrival of the term the shaman was a new stage in evolution in terms of how it was that you and I were able to interact. Because in previous episodes, as an example, we have spent a great deal of time nailing down the definition of such terms as tangibility. When we would be talking about any given subject matter, any given topic, tangibility is an extremely important characteristic. We always talk about what's the argument? Do you have an argument? Arguments are extremely important. Tangibility is extremely important. But what the shaman allowed for, not only as a metaphor, but also as a term, was an ability to open up a space in which a couple of things can be understood. Number one, the speech being uttered is not clear. The speech being uttered is dark and murky. The speech being uttered doesn't initially hold up to scrutiny. The speech being uttered doesn't make sense upon first glance, but it provides material to process. It pulls material out of the chaos of the unknown, not perfectly into articulated knowledge, but there's something to work with here. There is no argument. There are no premises and conclusions here. It's pre-articulation, it's pre-argumentation form, it's pre-syllogism. But just because you don't have a syllogism doesn't mean that you're left with nothing. And more particularly, perhaps more interestingly, the type of speech that we categorize under the shaman, it has a predictive quality as well.
I need to correct you there because it can have a predictive quality.
Sure.
There's a problem that's starting to arise out of this that I can start to describe, but basically there's a distinction that needs to be made. The shaman can have a predictive quality, but they're not always right, and that's why they can't be the ruler.
I will get to that.
But there's a distinction there because you have to say that there is a sequence to arrive at articulated knowledge, because articulated knowledge is incredibly difficult work to generate. And there's an infinite amount of chaos that needs to be ordered. Bringing articulated knowledge out of chaos, sometimes, especially with things that are very rooted or very high up the meta chain, I suppose. If we're talking about the archetypes, they're very difficult to articulate properly, even though something that hits the archetype resonates with an individual because they know that there's something correct about it, even though it's not being explained to them directly. It's being explained to them indirectly with the story. So arriving at articulated knowledge can have an intermediary step, like you're talking about with the artwork, where first, in order to get to articulated knowledge, especially with things that are really complicated, and there are more things that are complicated than anyone can manage, so if you need things that are more complicated, that's not a problem. one of the first steps to being able to bring order out of that chaos is to get something to work with at all. And that becomes a kind of what we would refer to as unarticulated knowledge. I have a little bit of a quadrant structure where we have basically a description that comes out of the known and the unknown, but it allows for the circles that you were describing, where you have articulated knowledge versus unarticulated knowledge. Well, that implies that there are two types of known and that there are two types of unknown. And if I were to be very obnoxious, I would say that there's the known known, the unknown known, the known unknown, and the unknown unknown. But if I were to be less obnoxious about it, there would be the distinction of these two sides basically by saying you have the known, which is the articulated known, the ability to articulate, which gives you the articulated versus the unarticulated. So the articulated known versus the unarticulated unknown as a form of description and distinction. And this is pitted against the known as in the understood. So we have the understood known or the not understood unknown to layer on a little bit of redundancy. But what that gives you is something that you know because you can articulate it and you understand. So the articulated known with the understood known would be articulated knowledge. That's something that you know what it is and you can say what it is. But there's this other thing which would be unarticulated knowledge. It's something that you know. It's something that you understand, but it's not something that you can articulate.
This is a really good segue, actually, into something that we were talking about in episode 3. A very, very good segue.
I just want to finish my 4 boxes because I have them. There's also the ability to articulate what you do not understand, which would be basically a form of articulated confusion. So I am confused about this. This is something that I can articulate that I don't understand. I know that this is an area, for example, that I need to improve my skills in. And then there would be the unarticulated unknown with the not understood, which is absolute confusion. No idea what's going on, and you don't even understand that you don't understand what's going on. So that creates a situation where you have articulated knowledge, unarticulated knowledge, articulated confusion, and absolute confusion, at least in this initial little description that I have in front of me, which is itself teetering between articulated and unarticulated knowledge. I'm not entirely happy with it, so it's leaning more towards unarticulated knowledge, kind of a general stab at trying to make sense of it. And then it might fail, but then I can replace it with something else. So unarticulated knowledge oftentimes is a form of function. First function, then improvement.
I'm going to slingshot into that point. One of the things that we talked about in episode 3 was the necessity of guarding against appeals to relativism. That was pathological statements like my logos, my truth, your truth, your way of thinking versus my way of thinking. These are all subcategories under appeals to relativism. That's not the way I think. This is not my truth. This is your truth. And these appeals to relativism are usually rejections of syllogistic reasoning. Because a lot of times when individuals are confronted with syllogisms that run counter to their claims, they don't know how to counter the syllogisms. And they are unwilling to retract from positions that are potentially extremely pathological. So what they do is they double down on the pathology by rejecting syllogisms entirely. Basically saying, although you have a syllogism demonstrating the exact opposite of my position, I am going to reject the validity of syllogisms entirely. And saying that although I do not have a counter syllogism and I have no way to undo your syllogism, I'm just going to undo syllogisms entirely because I can know things without having to deal with syllogisms. Hashtag my truth, your truth. Now, we didn't talk about this at the time. However, we must be very careful that Greek wisdom doesn't take over everything. We must be very careful with the idea of articulated knowledge being the only legitimate form of knowledge. The example that I use for that, and this is something that comes out of epistemology, is Robert Nozick's thought experiment of the chicken sexer, where on the heels of the Gettier cases, there's this entire segment of epistemology that is trying to answer the question of, okay, well, what are the necessary conditions that somebody needs to be able to meet in order to be able to qualify them as actually being able to know something? And a lot of what came out of those debates on the heels of the Gettier thought experiments started turning into some variant, some form of argumentation that led toward the direction of needing to be able to articulate what it is that you as an individual understand in order to be able to qualify as being able to know what it is that you know. Yes, this is something that you know, versus, no, actually, you don't know this. What Robert Nozick did in response to the individuals who were trying to sequester knowledge to the category of articulated knowledge, being able to syllogistically explain what it is that you understand, know, and why, was his thought experiment of the chicken sexer. Now, the way I remember the chicken sexer example was that apparently new hatchling chickens, both males and females, look identical when they're newborns. You can't really tell apart which one's male, which one's female just by looking at them. So Robert Nozick concocted this thought experiment where you have this person sitting in a room or wherever, and there's this entire crates upon crates of baby chickens. And you just, one by one, you hold the chicken up in front of this guy and he tells you male, female, male, female, male, male, female, female. He's able to identify what the sex of the chickens are just by looking at them. Robert Nozick then went on to further say that this guy who was looking at these baby chickens and is able to correctly identify the sex of the chickens every single time has no idea how he's doing it. He just looks at the chickens and says, it's a male, it's a female. I don't know how I know. I just look at it and I know. Completely unable to defend or to explain his process, his methodology. To bring this back to terms that we talked about in previous episodes, the question of how this guy identifies the sex of the chickens is completely intangible. No idea what he's doing, but is able to do it every single time. What Robert Nozick was trying to demonstrate in this thought experiment was this idea of, does this guy actually know what the sex of the chickens are? He's getting it right all the time, but he has no idea what's happening. Does that disqualify him from knowing? And so for the formal academic philosophy geeks out there, this is what gave rise to Robert Nozick's counterfactuals, where the qualification for knowledge is, if something is true, then the person would believe that it's true, but if something is not true, the person would not believe that it's true. So according to what Robert Nozick was proposing at the time, knowledge is defined as an ability for a belief to track the truth, to actually track the state of affairs. So the idea being that there's this sort of leashing mechanism where you have belief and you're able to latch it onto a particular fact that exists independently in the world, and whatever the fact is, the belief will follow along with it, and that's knowledge. Not really relevant to our discussion here. What I'm trying to drive home with this is that there's a very fine line that must be walked. There exists a threshold that is absolutely devastating when the threshold is mismanaged. On the one hand, somebody looking at a syllogism and proclaiming it doesn't apply, although this syllogism demonstrates the opposite of my position, I don't have to contend with this syllogism because my truth, your logos, my logos, and I just know the opposite, and that's the end. That's a pathological response. And when individuals like this are confronted with the question of, well, how is it that you know what it is that you're proclaiming? And then they say, well, it's a mystery. It's unknowable. You just know. I just know. It's fairly easy to demonstrate why this is pathological. I remember a professor back in university having a phrase that went something along the lines of, you have to be really prudent and really careful about slapping the mystery button. He would very comically say, this mystery button, you're just like, oh, well, what about this thing? How do you deal with this question? Just slapping like, oh, it's a mystery. I don't know. I'm now off the hook from having to explain anything. That obviously doesn't work. On the other side of this threshold, however, we must be able to understand that articulated knowledge can also arrive to wrong conclusions. That's entirely possible. It is very, very possible for articulated syllogisms to be incorrect, to be limiting, to cut individuals off from sufficient information. This is all possible. There is a role for intuition. Something is wrong. I don't know why, but something is off. The opposite end of that is also incorrect. You can't just willy-nilly do away with intuition. These are forces that balance each other out. So this goes back to your earlier comment about shamans can't be kings. That's a further allegory, a further metaphor that has arisen in the context of our discussions and our parlance as a mechanism to describe the appropriate way, the appropriate procedures by which the individual handles, on the one hand, articulated syllogisms, and on the other, intuition. You need to be able to do both. What is the proper place? What is the proper context? What is the proper roles that each one of these functions are supposed to play? And that's when we started talking about allegories of shamans or oracles and kings, because the allegory that exists in our parlance states that disaster happens when you give the executive authority, the executive function to the shaman or to the oracle, who's out of their mind because they're so firmly strapped to the front of Persig's train, trying to figure out what the hell is going on, that when you consign the crown to the shaman or to the oracle, problems happen, disaster happens. You can't mix those functions together, which is really, to bring that out of the allegory, out of the analogy, is to say that you should not base all of your decisions and all of your choices off of what intuition tells you alone. How do you make a decision? Oh, what does my intuition tell me? Oh, I'm just going to consult the intuition. I'm going to consult what I feel. Probably not the wisest procedure. Probably not the most reliable procedure. But that doesn't mean that intuition has no function. That doesn't even necessarily mean that you will not be in certain situations where you have no choice but to make a decision based off what your intuition is telling you. Those situations certainly do exist, but you need to be able to identify what those situations are. Even the king goes to consult the oracle. When the king has no idea what to do, even what we saw until we have faces, the king is in a bind. The king isn't sure what to do. If the king already knows what to do, just kick the high priest, kick the oracle back to their mountain temple and let them chill. Call you when I need you. But when there are problems, there are questions that the executive function of articulated knowledge doesn't know what to do, the executive function of the individual, what we allegorically refer to as quote-unquote the king, doesn't have the information that he needs, get the shaman over. Call the oracle over. We are dealing with the unknown and I don't have a mechanism to proceed. What does the oracle have to say? What does intuition have to say? Does that mean that the oracle, the shaman, intuition gets a carte blanche? No. But there is a function in the decision-making process.
There's also value that the king sees in the oracle, because looking at this passage, for example, the oracle had a meeting without the king. And the king said, well, how dare you have a meeting without me? I'm the king. He said, well, because we're beholden to something that's higher than you. And the king ought to recognize the value of an individual that is going to help them confront the unknown, like you're saying, the way that the king is facing the unknown and doesn't understand how to proceed. The king doesn't want to just do away with the oracle so that they have a way to proceed. The king doesn't want to be an oracle. The oracle doesn't want to be a king. And the oracle doesn't want to do away with the king either. Both can be wrong, but both have a different procedure. Neither party wants the other party to be dishonest. And neither party wants the other party to be wrong, in the sense that both parties want the mutual pursuit of the logos, at least when things are working properly. Because the truth might not be something that is immediately favorable, but that's information that you want. That's information that the king ought to want, or that even the shaman ought to want. And in this case, the shaman is bringing important information to the king, saying these things are very serious, and I don't know exactly what we're supposed to do about it, but there's something wrong. There's something corrupted. There's something hidden. There's something cursed. Anyone can look at that, like the Greek, the fox, for example, can look at that and say intangible, which he did. But the priest's response is basically to say, of course it's intangible. I barely know what I'm talking about, but it's closer to the logos than anything you have. I barely know what I'm talking about. You don't know what you're talking about at all. This is very much granting situations where people are correct, because the epistemic issue of whether someone is or isn't correct at the time where these decisions need to be made adds additional layers of complication to the decision, of course.
And the other thing that I want to drive home in the context of intuition versus articulated knowledge, particularly as it arises out of the allegory of the shaman or the oracle versus the king, or the fox even, is these functions are supposed to be able to exist within a single individual. This is not a thing of personality types. This is not, oh, I'm more of a shaman, or I'm more of a fox, or I'm more of a whatever. No. The well-rounded, the complete individual is supposed to be able to have access to both of these functions. Both of these functions ought to be able to exist within one head.
Well, they have to. So these characters in the story, as stories do, they create extreme circumstances to make a point. And if we're talking about what an individual is able to articulate or not, and what they do or do not understand, even the basic binary of how an individual handles the known versus the unknown, these are not the same procedures. There has to be a balance between the known and the unknown. That's the line of meaning, is partially in the known, partially in the unknown.
Which also comes out of Dr. Peterson's work. He talks about that a lot.
You can't just do away completely with one or the other. You can't say that you know everything because you don't, but you can't say that you know nothing because you do.
How are you tying that to the relationship between the articulated knowledge of the fox versus the unarticulated knowledge of the shaman?
Well, the fox is the one that says, you, the priest, can't tell me that I don't know anything because I do. And the character, the priest, is looking at the fox and saying, you can't say that you know everything because you don't.
I see. I want to kind of laterally drift around this, particularly on the point about how both of these functions are supposed to be able to exist inside a single person's head. One of the points that I have on my notes here is the idea of epistemic responsibility and epistemic humility. We were talking about this earlier about how the king and the shaman cannot be the same person, because really bad things start happening when you completely consign the executive decision-making function to the realm of intuition. How do I make my executive decisions? Oh, I go based off what I feel.
That becomes irresponsible very quickly.
Yes, and what I want to spend a couple of minutes doing is I want to tease out and I want to explain why it is exactly that. It's irresponsible. I don't just want to leave that there as a given.
Okay.
Why is it so irresponsible? Well, because responsibility is intimately tied with the notion of a proper way of doing things. There is a proper and improper way of doing X. And it is impossible for something to be responsible and improper at the same time. That's a contradiction in terms. inherent in the idea of responsibility is proper, particularly when it comes to decision making.
Well, of course. I mean, it's self-referentially incoherent to say that the responsible is improper, because if the thing that you're doing is responsible, it cannot be improper, because if the thing is improper, but you're doing it responsibly, then that means that you are properly doing the improper thing. Which means that the description of being proper supersedes anything that can be improper, or just envelops it.
So we have this important thing of intuition, this important thing of unarticulated knowledge, because a lot of times if you are confronted with a choice, you have to choose A or B, and your articulated knowledge is not sufficient to help you with that choice. That's when the shaman comes in. That's when intuition comes in and starts having a say. Now, here's the thing. Is it possible to be responsible and still have a bad outcome? Yes, absolutely. Because the world is chaotic. The world is full of uncertainties. You can do everything in your power that you ought to have done and still have things gone poorly. That just happens. That's something that we learn in such basics as wilderness survival training and first aid, as an example of where, yes, going out into the wilderness, going out camping, there is a risk. Things can go poorly. You can mitigate those risks. You can take the appropriate precautions, but it is very possible that you'll be walking along and you're doing everything correctly, but you inadvertently step on a loose rock and you twist your foot and you break your ankle. That really sucks. Does that mean that you should nix entirely? Oh, you might twist your foot and break your ankle, therefore people should not go camping, people should not go hiking. No. It is still possible to do things responsibly and still have suboptimal, if not outright poor outcomes. No question. That's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is being able to understand the term responsibility as being tied to mitigating risk, taking appropriate precautions, making appropriate decisions, understanding that there are no guarantees. Of course, there are no guarantees. Sort of the opposite of the injured hiker with the broken ankle who did his or her due diligence is the individual who looks at day trading and says, I'm going to trade naked options on the S&P 500 because all I need is for this one trade to go to the moon and I'll be able to retire tomorrow. I'm going to put all my money on this one trade. You know, there are risks, there are no guarantees, but you need to be able to take risks in order to get rewards. No. Or let's put an even more comical example. Taking all of your money going to Vegas and putting it all on black at the roulette table.
Twice. You won the first time.
The idea being, no, that is an irresponsible decision because both the roulette table and hiking both involve risk. But responsibility describes an appropriate relationship to that risk, specifically in the context of decision making. When the generic individual is confronted with a decision to choose between A and B, and articulated knowledge is not sufficiently helpful, or even when articulated knowledge leans toward, let's say, A, but intuition is saying, A might not be a good idea, even though A has a syllogism to defend it. You might want to consider B. Notice how that phrasing even came out of my mouth just there. You might want to consider. Intuition doesn't get 100% authority, but it has a role. The intuition has to speak from a position of humility. Having intuition speak from a position of humility is what allows the individual to use intuition responsibly. Intuition without humility becomes irresponsible. Specifically, epistemic humility. It is possible that your intuition is telling you something that is actually real, something that is actually out there in the void, in the unknown, in the world that you don't have access to, but there is a very, very high probability that it is not exactly what it is that you are describing. The generic individual needs to be able to account for that. There is something there that you, the generic individual, need to be mindful of, but it's possible, even highly probable, that it's not exactly what it is that your intuition is telling you. It might be something else. It might be worse. It might be better. You don't know. But the appropriate executive function, the appropriate decision-making process is not one that says, oh, this information coming from intuition is intangible, therefore I, the generic individual, can disregard it. I can regard it as not being there. I don't have to account for that because it's just nonsense. No. You need to be able to account for this, as unclear and as murky as it is. You ignore the information that intuition tells you at your peril. That's the logic behind the allegorical statement that says the king and the shaman cannot be the same person. Because it's a responsibility issue. It leaves the door way too open for disaster to come in. It doesn't properly mitigate against disaster.
It allows errors to accumulate. Because a lot of what intuition is seeking to do, sometimes at least, is to expose a hole in your understanding. And if you're operating in a manner where you're making errors and the errors are small, but there's something wrong, but you don't know what it is, that's the time to pay attention, not the time to ignore it. Because if there's nothing wrong, then great. But if there is something wrong, then you're going to want to fix that before the dragon grows. You don't want problems to grow and cultivate in your blind spots where you're not paying attention. Especially if you're purposely not paying attention because you're purposely ignoring the possibility that something could be wrong. Paying attention to both the articulated and the unarticulated forms in a decision can be very challenging to manage, especially because it takes practice to be able to do it well. There's a kind of sub-intuition that also kicks in as to whether or not it's better to follow the articulated knowledge or the unarticulated knowledge in certain situations, which is itself a form of unarticulated knowledge. But in the case of the story out of C.S. Lewis, the king doesn't want to do away with the shaman, because if the king did away with the shaman, then things would deteriorate rapidly. These problems would not be accounted for, they'd be made worse. These problems would grow, multiply. He's not even paying attention. He doesn't even know that there are problems. They're just getting bigger.
And the priest says so himself in the passage. You, king, don't even know what's going on inside the walls of your own palace.
Right. And intuition can be a vital tool, which allows for the ability to pay attention to some subtleties. Basically because in the king's situation, what would happen is, if you don't have the aid of the tool of intuition at some point, and he's in his palace and he barely knows what's going on in his own palace, much less in his kingdom, the problems grow, and the king doesn't know about the problems until they're so big that they end the king. And the king doesn't want that to happen, so he's not going to do away with the shaman. He doesn't want the problems to grow so much behind his back that they become problems that he now can't do anything about. He wants to do something about these problems while he still has the agency to do so.
One of the things that Dr. Peterson talks about in his commentary about Mesopotamian myth is that the Babylonian god Marduk is characterized by the fact that he's covered in eyes. He has eyes all around his head. There's an implicit function of awareness and seeing in what makes this archetype of what's supposed to make a good king.
Be a good Marduk.
Yeah, and part of those eyes is the function of intuitive understanding.
Pay attention.
Pay attention.
One of the vital components of being a good leader. Pay very close attention to everything around you all the time.
And that's paired with Dr. Peterson's commentary about Marduk's power stemming from his ability to use the magic speech to bring order out of chaos. And this is something that we touched upon in our previous episode in talking about the logos and that how the ordering of chaos is tied to the use of language. In that way,
that is spoken.
That is spoken. And that is what brings the order out of chaos. That's what advances human understanding. That's what keeps disaster at bay. Speech is what keeps disaster at bay. But that articulation has to be able to be paired with the unarticulated knowledge of intuitive understanding. It's what gives you the material to process to eventually distill and bring the axioms into fully articulated knowledge, provided you have the sufficient resources of time or energy, or in the worst case scenarios, when you have nothing, when the lion is upon you, when the enemy is at the gate, when you need to make a decision now, and there is danger at your doorstep right now. You don't have time for constructing a syllogism, laying out the decisions that you need to make. You need to make a decision now. In those instances, intuition's all you got.
Assuming that you haven't built those syllogisms already, they take time.
Correct.
So having an arc is helpful. But if the flood's here and there's no arc, then you use what you have and weather the storm, and flood's coming back again, so be ready for the next one.
So I have here in my notes, the shaman is a metaphor that describes how intuition is supposed to function. A lot of things that we say in our parlance, you ask me questions. What about this? What about that? What's the truth value of this statement? And a lot of times, I don't have clear answers. I don't have syllogisms to back up my answers. And so a lot of times what I say in response is, well, I don't know, but the shaman would say X. And what that preface does, the shaman would say blah, 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 is that it sets the stage for all parties who are participating in the conversation to understand that these words are intangible, but they are valuable. These words may not be clear, but it's the best you got for right now. There's something buried here.
What's interesting too is even though something might be intangible at the time, a description might be intangible at the time, given enough time, that description can become tangible as to whether it was accurate or inaccurate. So these are still descriptions which generate the ability to make decisions. They still impact decision making. And there are decisions that can be made so as to investigate whether or not the tangibility of the shaman's utterances holds or does not. And there are examples of both, where the shaman's utterances were making a general prediction and they were correct, and the shaman's utterances made a prediction and they were wrong. But knowing after the fact whether those utterances were correct or incorrect is still extremely valuable. The science is useful either way, in that testing the hypothesis of the shaman and holding it until a later time to see when the shaman's utterances become tangible, if they were correct or not, is valuable if they're correct and valuable if they're incorrect, for both me and for the shaman. But what happens that's very curious is that when you are speaking as the shaman and you make an utterance that has some kind of quality of making a prediction, I will take that and I will say intangible, and then I will say, well, I wonder if I can make it tangible somehow eventually or not. Sometimes I can make it tangible eventually, and then I come back and I say, this is what the character, the shaman, would have needed to say to my response being intangible. This is how you would describe the situation in terms that I would have been able to understand at the time, and then I would have been able to believe you. And those are always entertaining conversations.
Very.
There are also situations where I can demonstrate tangibly that the utterances of the shaman were completely incorrect. But that's very helpful because it impacts the intuition. The character that is the shaman takes the information of being wrong and says, okay, missed the mark on that one. Maybe there were some other things I should have been accounting for. Like you were saying, the oracle can be wrong, and they can realize that they're wrong. Just like the fox can be wrong and realize that he's wrong too. It's also helpful for me because if the predictions are correct, then that actually forms an interesting dynamic of reliability, which implies the opposite. If they're not, then that creates an interesting dynamic of unreliability, both of which I would like to know. Is this source giving me unreliable information? Should I do the opposite, generally speaking, in terms of how it impacts a decision? Sometimes these are important things to consider while using the logos to derive the best way to proceed. how intuition is supposed to function.
So then the question that naturally arises from that, well, how is intuition supposed to function? And I think that a common thread that's coming out of this dialogue is one that states that intuition is supposed to operate in tandem with articulated knowledge. It's not supposed to be one or the other. Intuition is supposed to provide to articulated knowledge material that articulated knowledge would otherwise not have access to. Another phrase that exists in our parlance is the allegory of an event horizon, which is something that is taken from astrophysics when describing black holes. So the idea of the event horizon is that it comes from the law of physics that states any information that goes into a black hole is lost, because the only way that we can observe anything is when light bounces off the thing and returns back to us. But the problem is when light goes into a black hole, it doesn't come back. So the idea being that there's this horizon, sort of like on the curvature of the Earth. Once you go over a certain point, we can't see what's on the other end of the Earth because the horizon blocks our view. In a similar way with the black hole, there gets this certain point where whatever enters into the black hole basically just disappears. Like, we don't have access to the information of what's going on in the black hole. From our vantage point, we don't have access to what's going on at the other end of the horizon because simply we cannot observe it. The event horizon, granted, I am not a physics major. I am not a physicist. I am not an astrophysicist. My understanding of it is taken from A Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking. But as I understand the way Stephen Hawking described these concepts in that particular text, was that there exists this threshold in which information is functionally the equivalent of being non-existent because we do not have access to it. It's in the black hole, it's gone. What intuition does is that it's able to reach into the recesses of a metaphorical black hole and bring some semblance of data information back out for articulated knowledge. And that's what enables the concentric circles to grow on Dr. Peterson's PowerPoint chart. Unarticulated knowledge, intuitive understanding, is constantly interfacing with the void, is constantly interfacing with the chaos of the unknown. And it operates as this transitory space that brings the information from the chaos of the unknown to the inner circle of articulated knowledge. And that's where the processing sort of happens.
The inner circle of
articulated knowledge.
Articulated knowledge?
Right, because if I'm remembering this correctly, the way that Dr. Peterson describes it is that the outer circle of unarticulated knowledge is where artistic generation occurs.
Okay.
This is the realm of the artists. This is the realm of the dramatists.
Right.
And then they are trying to encapsulate the information that is getting pulled out of the void.
Right.
And then as it goes through this space, then the distilled articulated understanding then takes those artworks, takes the generative work that exists in the outer circle, and then brings it into full articulated knowledge, and then that's what expands the inner circle.
Okay, but are you talking about the role of intuition as it interfaces with the void, or are you talking about the role of intuition as it interfaces with unarticulated knowledge?
When I was talking about the part of reaching into the event horizon, that was a commentary about unarticulated knowledge as it interacts with the void, and then turns around, and then we've already been talking a lot about how unarticulated knowledge and articulated knowledge are supposed to be interacting with each other.
Right. So I just wanted to clarify that because what I heard was that intuition interacts with the void and then pulls from the void information, knowledge that becomes articulated knowledge. But I think that you're saying that it becomes unarticulated knowledge first.
Yes, correct.
Okay, so is that to say that intuition generates unarticulated knowledge by interacting with the void?
Right. Which is something that articulated knowledge does not elegantly do.
Articulated knowledge does not interact with the void.
If it does, it doesn't do so elegantly.
Well, that's part of the major binary distinction between the known and the unknown.
No.
They're not the same. So the known would be in the category of articulated knowledge, And the unknown would be in the category of the void, and they're very squarely not in the same place. The event horizon is a dangerous place to journey, but sometimes it's the only place that will give you what you need. In the midst of the darkest parts of the unknown, that's where you find what allows you to continue. It's another narrative archetype. This is also a metaphor which acts as a mode to access the logos through unarticulated knowledge, which is simply to say, when articulated knowledge is insufficient or dysfunctional, again, the best option, the option that is closest to the logos, might not be articulated knowledge. It might be unarticulated knowledge. And recognizing that possibility is inherent to the definition of the shaman. I do think it's safe to say that intuition, as it's supposed to function, is still tied to the process of using the logos to generate the best option. And again, I do think that it's impossible to disregard unarticulated knowledge for articulated knowledge, especially if all articulated knowledge starts as unarticulated knowledge first. You can't denigrate unarticulated knowledge if it's the source of all articulated knowledge in sequence. Whether it's right or wrong, has a true or false truth value, is a different question.
There's a periphery aspect to this as well that I want to share with the audience listening at home. Particularly when intuitive understanding is used properly. When you are making shamanistic utterances properly, i.e. from a position of humility, particularly as it pertains to epistemology. There are a couple of things that you need to be aware of. And just as a quick aside, I want to say shamanistic utterances need to come from a position of epistemic humility, because that's sort of very different from a lot of the decisive confidence that comes from articulated knowledge. When you have syllogisms, there's a very strong level of certainty that oftentimes comes with those syllogisms, particularly when it's in line with intuition. If you have syllogisms that are in line with your intuition, that's pretty good.
Freestanding claims that are correct?
Yeah. The point that I want to make is you need to be careful with your shamanistic utterances, because shamanistic utterances are brittle in the sense that, by definition, the shaman's utterances are not freestanding claims.
Well, they're not tangible.
Exactly right. So you need to be careful with the context in which you share those utterances. You need to make sure that you are speaking with people who are willing to listen to shamanic utterances and understand that what they're listening to is shamanic utterances. Shamanic utterances, particularly when they are spoken aloud, they only really work in a context of curiosity. Number one, the individuals listening to shamanic utterances need to understand that that's what they are. Shamanic utterances, and so they need to understand that what they're going to be hearing is intangible. And based off that understanding that what they're listening to is by definition intangible, that intangibility needs to be met with curiosity. If either of these things are missing, sharing your shamanic utterances will only probably bring you more grief than actual good, because that's what I mean by brittle. It is very easy for people to attack shamanic utterances, precisely because of the intangibility they carry from the realm of unarticulated knowledge. Be mindful of your surroundings. Be mindful of the individuals with whom you share these shamanic utterances.
And just to add on to that, the character of the priest and the fox was looking at the character of the priest and trying to make the utterances of the priest tangible, saying, well, it can't be both. It can't be both the greatest person and the worst person at the same time. Which is it?
The fox and the priest should be working in tandem, not in opposition. That's where the problem lies.
Right, because the point is that there's supposed to be a problem that needs to be solved. There's supposed to be corruption that needs to be found. And the character of the priest is saying, the problem is with an individual. So The fox's response to that is, okay, if there's corruption, we should find it. If it's an individual, then maybe. And there's a procedure to test to see if the utterances of the priest have any weight when the tangibility is actually acknowledged. And that's another thing that I think is very, very important as you're describing this situation where individuals need to understand that they're listening to something intangible, and they need to do it with a sense of curiosity, which is a lot of times something that is just a disclaimer the shaman gives, or just an acknowledgement in the face of someone saying that's intangible, or the more common response would be, that makes no sense. Then the person making the shamanic utterances would say in response, I know it doesn't make sense. That's not the point. It's not supposed to make perfect sense. It's supposed to be generally moving slightly in the right direction compared to where we are now. Try to find something in common. Try to make sense of it. That would be how they work in tandem, from what I can tell.
The passage here reads, they demand to see such things clearly, as if the gods were no more than letters written in a book. Holy places are dark places. It is life and strength, not knowledge and words, that we get in them. Holy wisdom is not clear and thin like water, but thick and dark like blood. So here's the thing. The priest's words here work as descriptive statements, not as normative statements.
Mm-hmm.
The importance of one does not denigrate the importance of the other. They both have their roles. They both have their functions. They're supposed to work in tandem.
Just because you have blood doesn't mean you don't need water.
Yeah.
Water's pretty useful, and water's definitely necessary.
And the same as the other way. The existence of water doesn't denigrate the importance and the necessity of blood either.
Right. What I wanted to reinforce was the allowing for the utterances of the shaman to become a kind of hypothesis.
Mm-hmm.
So when done properly, even if the utterances are intangible at the time that they're made, the utterances are made in such a way, again, when done properly, that given enough time, there will be tangibility to those utterances, which will make those utterances true or false. And that's part of the humility of making these utterances, is the understanding that the utterances could be wrong. And if you're making the utterances humbly, then you want to know if you're making errors, because you're trying to access the best way to proceed. And if what you have is not the best way to proceed, then fix it. Use that information to continue to generate the best way to proceed.
This is all revolving around the key points of the fox, the Greek wisdom, cannot do away with the shamanic utterances, cannot do away with the priest and the story, and the priest cannot do away with Greek wisdom, which basically just goes back to what we were saying earlier in the episode about how you cannot wholesale tie the executive function of decision-making to whatever intuition says. Oh, I'm going to make this decision because that's what I feel. I just know it. I can feel it, that this is the right decision to do. You need to corroborate that. That's fine, that you feel that you might just know it, and that may very well be true. You might be Robert Nozick's chicken sexer in this situation, but to be responsible, you need to corroborate what your intuition is telling you with something.
Mm-hmm.
That's where the Greek wisdom comes in. See if you can get these things to reconcile. It takes work, yes, but that's the appropriate way to proceed. Absent some dire emergency, but that's just to say, like what Dr. Peterson says, the flood is coming and you need an ark. You want your decision principles already in place when disaster strikes, because that level of computation is not something you want to be doing in the middle of a disaster.
Well, you can't do it in the middle of a disaster. It's not possible.
So, by way of just making sure everything is in its proper place, the shaman is a metaphor that describes how intuition is supposed to function. How is intuition supposed to function? Intuition is supposed to operate in tandem, not in contradiction to articulated knowledge and understanding.
It's a function of the logos.
Anything else you'd like to add?
It's a function of the logos, and it allows for the sequence of knowledge to be pulled from the void of the unknown into the unarticulated but understood, and then from there into the articulated and understood. So it's also a means, it's also a mechanism that allows for the sequence which enables articulated knowledge. The utterances can be brittle at the time, Sometimes, especially when things are very complicated, the utterances are the closest thing to the logos that you have. But that's nothing to denigrate because it, like I said, enables the process of articulating that unarticulated knowledge. The floor is opened up, falling through water or something dark. There's no ground underneath me. Hey, Shaman, do you think there's ground anywhere around here? If I put my arm over here, can I grab onto something? What's am I supposed to do now? I'm not looking for freestanding claims and tangible axioms. I'm looking for something slightly better than what I have, which in turn might even lead me to something slightly better than that I can actually stand on. Which is also to say, gaining access to the material that articulated knowledge would not have access to is also a means to an individual getting out of the void, if it's the individual that's in the void. If you're in articulated knowledge and then the ground of articulated knowledge opens up underneath you, like what would happen with the king, if the problems just kept accumulating and growing, and now there's nothing for them to hold on to anymore. There's no floor. They're in the void. How do they get back? Well, the articulated knowledge doesn't just appear, probably. If it did, it's because someone else already made this journey through the void, and how they got back from the void was through unarticulated knowledge first, and then they were able to articulate what happened. So if that articulated knowledge does manage to save someone from the void, then great, but again, you can't do away with unarticulated knowledge because it seems to me to be an intermediary to the articulated knowledge that is so valuable. Now perhaps the audience understands why we needed to extensively describe the term that is the shaman somewhat indirectly. The term has characteristics that aren't articulated knowledge, but there also exist terms that only exist for the shaman. Things that the shaman talks around because they cannot be defined. But that which cannot be defined is something that we will inevitably come back to.
Without a doubt.
There's an additional description of the event horizon, an additional description of the intuition filter that will definitely bring us back to that. We even mentioned it already a little bit in describing the logos, and describing meta, that which connects all the particulars. It's actually impossible to say, so I'm going to stop talking about it.
And that's that. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been the Garrote. And remember, until next time, Vidori Usperante. Keep breathing, everyone.